But some change is cyclical. It's just up on a different level. So I'm really excited today to get what I think is one of the better speakers on the circuit. I've met Jonathan Armstrong, our speaker today. I met Jonathan, geez, 5-6 years ago now, Jonathan. It's been a while, but Jonathan's a lawyer at Cordery, and I'll let him introduce himself. But I remember when I first heard him speak that he had a clarity of the market that I thought was very impressive, a clarity of the landscape of the legislation. I remember talking to him, and he was telling me, legislation is like a big freighter out at sea. When you see it coming, when you see GDPR coming from a long way away, it looks really small. Then suddenly, bang, it's in your port, and it's huge, and there's a lot of stuff to unpack. But Jonathan's one of those professionals, I think, that has the right perspective and can see things coming from a long way away and understand their size, their depth, and what that's going to mean when it actually arrives to us. So he's been very helpful to us here at the Risk Crew. He's one of our go-to guys, so we turn to Jonathan and his firm for legislative and compliance legal views on things. He's an expert that we lean on and have leaned on since the day I met him. So I'm really pleased that we've got Jonathan today. Jonathan's going to talk about a couple of things that we already know, and we talk about every year. And like I say, some change is cyclical. Yes, we're going to talk about the extended attack footprint, brought to us by the pandemic, and what that means in terms of mobile devices and things. But not just what it means in the last year, but what it's going to continue to mean, and certainly in the coming year and the years after that, as well as the evolution of things that we've all known and loved, like ransomware and the new evolution of attack and threat vectors. But I've also asked them to specifically speak on what should a CISO be looking to in this coming year. What will the board be expecting from a CISO this year? And certainly, are there any changes in how we should react to data breaches that we should be considering that have changed from the last year? So anyway, listen, my purpose here is just to introduce Jonathan and not take too much of his time, so he can impart the wisdom that we look to him for. But I would want to say this is a workshop, and when you've got an expert like Jonathan here, you want to take advantage of this. So I will be looking at all the incoming questions, and certainly throw them to Jonathan if we've got the opening. But at the end of the workshop, we also have questions and answers. We built in time for that. Jonathan's got some really good material, and we will take questions. Let's take advantage of our theme for today is take advantage of Jonathan. Let me shut up and just introduce Jonathan Armstrong. Jonathan, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Richard, and thanks for the kind introduction. It is going to be a rattle through some trends that we're seeing across our desk and some things that we think are going to happen in 2021. And just to give you a brief perspective, we're a niche compliance law firm. We deal with work in three main areas. So prevention, trying to stop bad things happening. That might be policies, it might be procedures, it might be advice on preventative measures. We do training. Again, that's with a compliance legal focus. So, for example, we do data breach academies where we run people through a data breach and help them develop the skills they'll need to respond to regulators, respond to people who are trying to bring class actions against them. And then the third area of our practice is intervention. So when bad things happen, how do you make them less bad than they might seem? And that obviously involves interfacing with regulators on a very frequent basis. For example, we've just had a case closed about 90 minutes ago relating to an Office 365 attack, and I'm not going to tell you anything about that in great detail, but that is going to inform a little bit about what I'm going to say as we go. So it's going to be an eclectic view, if you like, my personal opinions on some of the things that we're seeing and how significant they are. I'm going to speak for about 35-40 minutes. And then, as Richard said, very happy to answer questions. I think you can put them in the Q&A box and Richard will read them. So I think we would have to start any review of 2020 and any prediction of 2021 by looking at the pandemic, which is the, I guess, the elephant working from home. And thanks very much to Sarah for taking this picture of the outside of our office during the pandemic. Normally a very busy street in central London, and it's stating the obvious to say that 2020 was an absurdly difficult year for many CISOs, and 2021, I think, is likely to be the same. So for many CISOs, obviously, one of the real challenges is going to be hybrid working from home still. And for many, it's going to be managing workload, which I think regrettably will still be at really significant levels. At the same time, as I'm going to say, the regulatory regime is ramping up yet more. I know a lot of people did a lot of training around GDPR, and then in 2018, 2019, we didn't see that many cases. That was entirely predictable because these cases take time to ramp up, to investigate, to work up to a fine. But last year, obviously, we saw some really significant GDPR activity, so that as we sit here this afternoon, there are about 644 cases across the EU that have led to fines, and some 373 million euros in total. So what sort of topics are we going to cover? Well, first of all, we're going to pick that one up, the challenges of greater enforcement. Secondly, we're going to look at ransomware and the next generation of threat vectors. Thirdly, we're going to look at how to respond to a data breach, and that's going to be informed by the whatever it is 100, 120, 140 breaches that we've handled since GDPR came in. We're going to look at Richard's request, as he's mentioned, at what boards want from their CISO, and then we've got the Q&A session at the end. So let's start with the challenges of greater enforcement. Well, as I've said, 2020 was the year that GDPR really kicked in. And pre-GDPR, we always had these predictions, I think, that the two areas that regulators were likely to focus on were security and transparency and fairness. And I think that's definitely proved to be the case. But the percentages, I think, might be something of a surprise. Last year, just by some rough statistical analysis that we did, the transparency and fairness fines were about 61 million euros. And there were some very large cases on transparency and fairness, like the H&M case, the Grindr case, Notebooks Biller earlier this year, the CaixaBank case in Spain earlier this year. So those fines are still going through, and they're still increasing, and some of them have an interaction with security as well. So if you look at Notebooks Billinger, the German case in January, for example, a 10 million euro fine for lack of fairness and transparency, but for lack of fairness because the company didn't explain its security stance correctly to staff. So that's mostly in the areas of CCTV. So there's a great connection, if you like, between security and treating people fairly. H&M would be another example, 35 million euro fine, but that comes on the regulator's radar because of a security breach. So we're certainly seeing more enforcement of existing laws, and we're seeing significant non-monetary penalties as well. And one of the trends I think we will see for 2021 is smarter regulation. We will see regulators use the non-fining powers more to stop people doing stuff. And I'll give you just one example, the Facebook Dawn raid in February last year. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, Facebook said that they were going to launch online dating in Europe in February. They went and told the Data Protection Commission in Ireland, their lead regulator under GDPR. The regulator said to them, well, that's interesting. Let's see your data protection impact assessment, which proves that you've designed in privacy and your GDPR obligations into your online dating. And we don't know exactly what happened, and it may well be that one day we'll find out when more details of the investigation become public. But it seems that the DPC did not get the answer they expected from Facebook. It seems that they certainly didn't get the "here's the DPIA, enjoy, let us have any comments." And Facebook said that they planned to launch on Valentine's Day last year. The regulator wasn't happy. They knocked on the door just before Valentine's Day, used their dawn raid powers under GDPR, and as a result, the Facebook dating service didn't launch. Now, why is this more significant than a fine? Well, you might remember, for example, pre-GDPR, after the Cambridge Analytica episode, the ICO fined Facebook after the event, and they fined them the then statutory maximum of £500,000. Now, that doesn't even, Mark Zuckerberg doesn't go back to Mrs. Zuckerberg and say, honey, we're not going on vacation this year because I've just been fined by the ICO. For organizations like Facebook, it's hard to get fines that stick and that are impactful. And what the DPC did is perhaps somewhat cleverer by persuading Facebook under threat of regulatory action to halt the service. What then happened, of course, is the pandemic started to hit. Online dating suffered its equivalent of the gold rush, with people rushing onto dating online because they couldn't leave the house. And as a result, not only were Facebook denied entry into that market at the time of biggest growth, but it also enabled some of the businesses that Facebook wanted to knock out of the water to gain strength enough in some cases like Bumble to IPO and have more longer term financial security because of that market expansion whilst Facebook weren't able to participate. So I think we're going to see regulators across Europe look at this as an interesting way of enforcing GDPR. We've already seen it in the UK, for example, with the destruction order against HMRC for some of the data that it obtained. And in some respects, that's going to be more difficult for some companies to deal with. If you're forced to delete a database that you've gathered over 8 years, that can be more damaging to organizations than a fine. But we will certainly see fines as we progress, and we're tracking some developments. For example, Spain has the most fines in terms of numbers, but not in terms of the amount of the fine. We've already seen in 2021 an increase in fine levels from Spain, which could have an effect across the EU. So fines,
if I could
yeah, Richard.
Sorry, Jonathan, we've got an interesting question while we're on GDPR. We've got a question in from saying that given that Alex Voss, who's technically the father of GDPR, has recognized a lot of problems and said GDPR already needs overhaul, particularly in things like blockchain that don't have the ability to enforce right to forget. You see any changes or in another round of legislation that would address things like blockchain?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Richard, and I think that might well happen. I think we did a client alert the day the first draft of what became GDPR came out, and I had to review it the other day, and I'm sort of self-congratulating because I think some of the things that we said then have proved true. So, for example, some of you will remember that there was this ridiculous statement at the time from the European Commission saying something like the existing directive hasn't stood up to time well, and we will future-proof GDPR so that it will last for generations. But that doesn't take into account the rapid pace of change, which is partly what Alex Voss is talking about. And at the same time, there are many German regulators who think that GDPR, as it stands, is too weak. And I think we will see a strengthening of EU GDPR. And as that distinction, many of you will know that that the UK has now what we call, for convenience, UK GDPR. So it's a cut and paste of most of the relevant provisions of EU GDPR into UK law. And I think we might see some divergence there for two reasons, really. Firstly, the UK has tended to be more pro-business, or at least in my opinion, has got the balance better between businesses and individuals. But secondly, because there is this move in the EU to strengthen GDPR, as you've discussed, and I think the UK has been a moderating voice around that table. And I know from speaking to some people who are with regulators in the EU, that is a real concern of theirs, that as the sort of pro-privacy, pro-individual lobby strengthens, if the UK is not there as a bloc, then GDPR, EU GDPR, I think, is likely to get significantly tougher. I don't think it will deal well with things like blockchain. I think it might have a go at dealing with things like imbalance in AI and distorted algorithms and algorithms reinforcing prejudice and all of that sort of thing. But I think there might be some populist moves in EU GDPR as well. So, for example, there is a proposal to ban employers from asking employees to check their emails outside working hours. And that is getting some considerable traction. So I think to answer the question, Richard, I think that we might get a change in EU GDPR and a convergence between UK GDPR and EU GDPR, not because UK GDPR gets weaker, but because EU GDPR gets tougher. Another area where this might be relevant is number 3 on the slide, in the area of data subject rights. We're already seeing more and more aggressive exercise of data subject rights from, I would say, about September, October, November time. I have a working theory that it's partly related to people seeing redundancies and downsizing coming as we move out of furlough. Companies will review their headcount. And I think oftentimes as you head into recession, you see employees particularly be more aggressive in asserting their rights. So we definitely see more DSARs, particularly from employees who think that they are vulnerable, or from employees who left the organization a year ago, 2 years ago, and are struggling to get new jobs. And some employers are making that more difficult for themselves, for example, by monitoring employee behavior when employees are working from home. Now, my understanding is that Office 365 out of the box, Zoom out of the box, has monitoring functionality. Some employees know that that exists, and that if the default settings aren't reversed, data on their activity is retained. And we're seeing DSARs specifically ask for that data. We're seeing in the EU, works councils become engaged on issues like monitoring. So DSARs are taking an awful lot of effort at the moment. We know from statistics that some people are saying it's costing £100,000 to comply with every subject access request. I think that's a really high amount. I think that partly speaks to maybe their lack of internal organization, but that's certainly a big trend for 2021, more enforcement of individual rights. There's changes around cookie laws as well. The whole cookie law thing is quite hard to keep up with. There's an update on our site, but just know that cookies are a long-standing area of regulation, and that will happen across the EU. We're struggling with issues around data transfer and the death of Privacy Shield. Many of you who transfer data from the UK to other countries, whether that be in the EU or the US, will be struggling with these issues. I think it's a good opportunity for CISOs. I think the double due diligence test that's brought in by the Schrems 3 case is a good opportunity for CISOs to get involved earlier when new vendors are selected, when new ways of working are selected. So I think this is an opportunity and a threat, but organizations will need to be really geared up to looking at where data moves, how that's legitimized, and we're seeing class action litigation on that already. Amazon, for example, in Munich, are facing a class action over the way in which they transfer data around their organization. I think Brexit is somewhat similar, and obviously there are challenges of Brexit. I know, Richard, your last talk was on the adequacy decision. I'm happy to give personal views on that afterwards. There's some films on our website as well if people are interested in the whole Brexit adequacy UK GDPR debate. And then the last one on as far as changes to the regulatory environment are concerned, then remember that as well as the GDPR regime and as well as the cookies regime, we have something called the NIS regime. And originally, the intention was that the NIS regime covered critical national infrastructure, and you may need to make data breach reports whether or not personal data is compromised under GDPR. You're only obliged to make a report if there's a concern about personal data. And NIS 2.0 expands on the sectors that are covered. So on this slide, you'll see NIS 1.0, which has what you might call a more conventional definition of critical national infrastructure. And then that's going to expand to include all of those sectors, but in addition, some additional services that some of us might not have considered critical national infrastructure historically. So if you're in one of those sectors that's in NIS 2.0, then obviously you'll need to beef up your security procedures and your security reporting procedures and work out who your regulator's likely to be, et cetera, et cetera. And then as far as UK data protection law is concerned, then I predict that we're going to see more enforcement of these specific criminal provisions that we have in the Data Protection Act 2018. So the UK has, if you like, bolted these provisions on top of GDPR. I definitely see Section 170 being used much more these days. There's a film on our YouTube channel for anyone who's interested about these offences in more detail and about their interrelationship with the Computer Misuse Act. In some respects, we're going to talk about future threats. In some respects, the law is becoming less relevant because it's only easy to prosecute relatively good people. It's, I think, somewhat ridiculous to think that you can use things like the Data Protection Act to prosecute nation-state hackers because you can't get hold of them, and there's all sorts of issues about extraterritoriality and the fact that they're often protected clearly by the state that's sponsoring them. But I think we'll see many almost good people gone wrong prosecuted under the Data Protection Act. And again, you often see that in terms of downsizing, employees taking data when they move from employer A to employee B, employers in the health service selling data or giving it away to family members, et cetera, et cetera. I think we're going to see more of these prosecutions. Obviously, very few of them will be of companies, but some of them, I think, will take up a lot of CISO time in terms of helping to gather evidence. And then the Section 1731, which relates to data subject requests, I foresee a lot of aggressive use of Section 173, particularly because, as I said, we're seeing more and more individuals assertively demand their rights under GDPR, as I've said, particularly those who think their job is under threat. So just as a quick reminder, there's no change to what the security obligation is under GDPR. The controller and the processor shall implement technical and organizational measures to ensure levels of security appropriate to the risk. None of that is new. That's more or less been UK law since 1984, when we had our first Act. So you've always got to be concentrating on technical and organizational measures. For those of you not familiar with that, to give you just an example, we got asked to test the GDPR compliance of a client in the US, and they operate a secure facility in Utah, as it happens. Because I'm childish and was a bit techie as a kid, I decided to try and disable their door entry system, which I managed to do without going into details, just by using a pack of Post-it notes. And so I was able to demonstrate that I had taken, that I'd disabled the door entry system and I can walk straight through. So the technical measure failed because they'd used a cheap PIR at the top of the door, easy to disable. But their organizational measures were perfect. As soon as I walked through that door, two guys appeared who looked like linebackers in American football, asked me what my business was, and to cut a long story short, offered me a trip down to the dustbins. So the technical measures had failed, the organizational measures protected the organization. So for any CISO, I think what we're going to see in 2021, many of you do it already, is much more of a link with other teams, not just looking at technical measures, looking at organizational measures, looking at training within the organization, looking at physical security. I think that mix becomes all the more relevant when people are involved in hybrid working from home, more swapping of desks, etc., etc. So there's more of a holistic view, I think, that we're going to see in 2021.
Jonathan, let me interrupt one more time. We've got about 10 questions, as I knew there would be, about any prognosis, anything in your crystal ball about cloud service providers, SPII, 365, Google Cloud, handling cloud, post-Schrems 2. This idea of the GDPR is not still sufficiently addressing how we're handling SPII in any cloud platform, and how will that affect compliance or non-compliance? Anything happening this year?
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of activity around that. Traditionally, the attitude after the first Schrems case, for example, I'm being slightly mischievous, but the attitude of a lot of cloud providers was to stick their fingers in their ears and go la 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 la, doesn't affect us because we're based in the US. I think that there's been a real change now. If you look at Schrems 3, Schrems 2 to the non-purist, the latest Schrems, let's call it, where I think a lot of cloud providers have become much more engaged, and they know that if you haven't got a plausible answer, then you lose business. And I think that the likes of Microsoft were seen not to be as good at reacting to the death of Safe Harbor as other providers were, and as a result, I suspect they lost business. And that's, I think, why Microsoft's reaction to the death of Privacy Shield has been more involved. I think that we are always going to struggle with cloud providers, but at the same time, the business's resistance has reduced. If you looked at 5 or 6 years ago, we did a survey for a client, I think, where I think about 50% of businesses would not have cloud anywhere in their operation. I think if we did the same survey again, I think the numbers would be reduced significantly. Most organizations will have cloud of one shape or form, and even if they're not hosting their own data, they're using PeopleSoft or Salesforce or whatever, and that data has been hosted in the cloud. The practical step, I think, is this double due diligence test and to do a data protection impact assessment. And happy to walk through some tips on that. And indeed, I think on our YouTube channel, there's a 3-minute film, how to do a DPIA in 3 minutes. For full disclosure, doesn't give you all the answers, but I think gives people a framework to deal with that in the short term. So topic 2, how to respond to a data breach. Well, I think what we've seen from our experience is that organizations do better when they rehearse and when they have a plan. We've done 2 data breaches now, where we've said to them, where's your data breach response plan? And I kid you not, 2 organizations have said, yeah, actually, the last time we did a proper response plan was for year 2000. Will our Y2K plan work? And the first time I thought, that's completely crazy. No, of course it won't, but send it over and we'll have a look. And it was broadly okay. The second one actually was sort of fine. At least it got the organization concentrating their mind and roles and responsibilities. But to state the obvious, having a plan that is 21 years old is not good enough. Regulators will expect you to have a plan and to rehearse that plan. There's guidance, for example, from the Dutch data protection regulator that says just that thing. You've obviously got to know your data and your third parties. And I know, Richard, that you've had many discussions on things like Article 30 records and records of processing, and I won't repeat all of that. But what I will say is that the world for most of us has changed. So what was core business even 5 years ago is now outsourced. If we look at things like HR records, travel, expense management, payroll, we outsource more of that than we ever did before. And trust me, from having been involved in those breaches, when your third party lets you down, it is often pretty ugly, because their priorities might not be your priorities, and their liability to you might be limited to $35,000. We had one case, very significant data breach for the client. It involved them having to lift employees out of high risk jurisdictions within 24 hours. And the third party said, yeah, we look at the agreement, our liability to you is $40,000. It's in your bank account. Now we're not going to answer any more questions, no more cooperation. Go away, you're maxed out. So you've got to know who your third parties are. You've got to know the data that they hold. You've got to assemble your team in advance. Again, we've had organizations that have been very slow out of the block because the team didn't know each other. So you've got to meet each other beforehand. You've got to know each other's strengths and weaknesses. Do data protection impact assessments as well. Respect the time 72 hours if GDPR is brought into play. We've had multinational businesses, for example, the most ridiculous I've seen is a US business who said that they had checked with their US counsel, who said that 72 hours did not work over Thanksgiving weekend, and that there was a specific exemption in GDPR which exempted people from working over Thanksgiving. That's just utter nonsense. And it's very difficult to go to a regulator and say to them, we didn't report in time because US counsel thought there was a Thanksgiving exemption. I think the risk there is you get fined once for the data breach, and you get fined a second time for having cloud cuckoo procedures in place. So you've got to have an eye on the clock all the time. In the Q&A, I'm quite happy to answer some questions on how I think you can do that best. Remediate, then report. So most people have a conventional train of thought where they go, okay, we've had a breach, we'll report it, then we'll fix it. My experience is that your regulatory outcome is likely to be significantly better if you reverse those steps. So we've had a breach, what can we do to fix it? Report it. You've still only got 72 hours to do it. But if, for example, there's a training need identified in the data breach, if you can get those individuals off the network, train them, then get them back and say to the regulator, we've done this work in the last 24 hours, your regulatory outcome is likely to be significantly better. Keep logs is obvious, and commit. This isn't just a quick hit. When you've had a data breach, you have to do a proper post-mortem. You have to look at what went wrong and fix it. Not only because you'll probably have to tell that to a regulator, you'll have to show your workings out and what you've done to improve the situation, but also because obviously regulators are tracking the number of data breaches. They're looking for similarities, and you will find yourself, as some of our clients have done, reinvestigated for breaches that were closed because it seemed that lessons weren't learned. And remember, always think TOMS. And if anybody would like a Cordray Sanitizer, the first person to name all of the TOMS, if you email me, you can win the fantastic prize of a Stay Safe Cordray Sanitizer. The next topic is ransomware, the next generation of threat vectors. I'm conscious that I'm speaking really quickly. We've got a lot to get through, but as I said, happy to answer questions at the end in a slower form if I'm speaking too quickly. So this is my Uncle Neil. And why are astronauts relevant to phishing? Why are they relevant to ransomware? Well, this is what I'd call a conventional phishing or ransomware attack. Some of you will see it. It's, I think, fairly comical. It relates to Major Abarcha Tunde, who apparently went to space on a Russian spacecraft, and he's been trapped in space. But happily, he's accrued his salary. And if you just agree to your bank account being used, the good major can return to Earth to an expectant family, and you'll make a bit of money along the way. Now, sad news, dear viewer, Major Tunde does not exist. And equally, I don't think Helen Paul exists. This is a more recent scam. You'll see, as many of you will have seen, a lot of COVID-related scams, a lot of things around downsizing, people moving roles, etc. And obviously Brexit scams as well. And the point of raising these is not because they're sort of state of the art, but one of the things that I feel very passionate about at the moment is we're training people often on old school threats. So we're buying training, or our training teams are buying training from providers who are still telling people that phishing attacks look like this, or that they look like the good major, and if a Nigerian astronaut wants to come home, don't click. But a lot of the gangs and a lot of the things that we see are much more sophisticated. Attacks across our desk are much worse during the pandemic. The attackers know how people work. They know the extended hours that people are working. And also, I think they know that we're denied what I sometimes call the Sandra in our office. So many of us, when we're working in the office, we've a co-worker who's just very sensible. And if we see an email in front of us that looks a bit dodgy, we say, Sandra, take a look at this. Does this look a bit dodgy? And she says, yes, it does. Don't click on it. And because we're missing the Sandra, many of the organizations that we've helped after an attack, we said, why did you click? And they said, well, I would normally ask Sandra, but it wasn't worth setting up a Teams call or a Zoom call or phoning her. And I just clicked on it because what was the worst that can happen? And attackers know this. We're seeing these sort of tag teams. Many of you, I'm sure on the call, are seeing it as well. These tag teams of Eastern European gangs that develop exploits and then sell them to African gangs who develop the social engineering to go with it. They're very, very clever, some of the attacks that we're seeing across our desk. CEO fraud is definitely on the rise, and somewhat surprisingly, people are falling for it. We've an organization that lost more than a month's total expenses in just 2 attacks. So people are still falling for these attacks. And from our sort of position of intelligence, we wonder why people fall for them, but they do. So education is critical, and education on today's threats, not yesterday's, is critical. We're seeing a lot of Office 365 compromises. Now, I think what that is it's just a factor of numbers. So, for example, when I first started, I think the first hack attack I looked at, I'm showing my age, was probably the late 80s. And it was a compromise of a VAX system, for people who remember VAX systems. You obviously couldn't compromise them internally. The compromise was people turning up at reception, working out that the receptionist was connected to the system, threatening her with a baseball bat, locking her in the cupboard and taking over the terminal. So attacks like that were quite intensive, and they cost money and they cost resources. If you look at 365 now, you can buy an Office 365 compromise for about $5,000, I understand. And it's just this industrialization. If you develop an exploit, the cost per organization just diminishes. And just as the model with 365 is almost like a production line of emails, then it's easy to set up a production line of exploits as a result. So that's not necessarily to single out Microsoft as being particularly vulnerable, but I can tell you that maybe 55, 60% of the incidents that come across our desk have an Office 365 element to them. Obviously, some people have missed patch cycles. We're seeing many payment scams related to corporate reorganization, to PPE at the moment. Ransomware is definitely on the increase. Activity of state-sponsored or state-condoned gangs is definitely on the increase. And I'll just explain the last three, which I think we're starting to see, but again, are really big predictions for me for 2021. So the picture that you can see on the screen is of a Tupperware party. Some of you are old enough to remember them. And basically the model of a Tupperware party was that a central unit, Tupperware, produced the goods. And then they sort of had almost like home sellers, almost like a franchise of people based at home who would use Tupperware to make a profit. So why is that relevant? Because it's almost exactly the same business model as the Revil ransomware gang. You have a central unit making exploits, and they then rely on home groups to go out and use those exploits, make money, bring it back to the central unit. And as a result, those gangs are really hard to attack for law enforcement, for example, because even if you can locate one of the house groups, you never get back to the central unit. And they're able to change their MO quickly. And it might be that few people in the gang know what all of the different bits of the operation are doing, just as Tupperware didn't know what all of the people in the home groups were doing either. And coupled with that, we've got the rise of cyber mercenaries. So some nations have obviously worked hard to train people in really advanced hacking techniques for cyber warfare, but they haven't paid them that well. And we're increasingly seeing African gangs, for example, hire this talent in because they can pay more than the state employer can. Highly trained people moving from the public sector to the private sector. And my wild prediction for 2021 is just as people pay ransomware less, and there is at least some hopeful news that suggests that ransomware is going down because people, and more importantly, insurers have stopped paying, then I think we're going to see some new iterations of these type of attacks, like cyber shorting, for example, where an organization will trade shares on the basis of its exploit, and they'll use that movement in shares to pay the gang back rather than a conventional ransom. So I'm slightly pessimistic about 2021 in terms of cybersecurity, because I think just as we're shoring up the defenses, and I don't, there's good work being done by government, NCSC, et cetera, but the attackers are highly resourced. And as I say, this worry of mine is that it's relatively easy to predict what public sector hackers are up to, but as they move into the private arena, it's harder to predict their next move. So obviously, you've always got to be prepared for the worst case. Things like DPIAs will help you do that. Then the final topic, and then some questions: what do boards want from their CISOs? Well, I think in the words of the late, great Roy Castle, the main thing they want is dedication, I think. One of the things that we're seeing as a trend, which I predict will continue into 2021, is the person responsible for dealing with the data breach is getting older. What do I mean by that? So if you're a listed entity, we're seeing increasingly that a non-executive director thinks, or a member of the audit committee thinks, that they've got to step in and manage the data breach. So as a result, you might end up with the most senior person in the organization, typically 70 plus, typically white, typically male, typically not a digital non-native, being in charge of the response team, because the consequences are greater, because we've got potentially 8% of revenue now if we're in the EU and UK, because GDPR fines double up. 8% is a big enough number for the board to want to be engaged on a day-to-day basis. So I think we're seeing the boards, first of all, want dedication from their CISO. Obviously, everybody knows 72 hours is tight, probably unachievable for most organizations. They want to see the CISO put in the hard yards. They want translation as well. As I've said, oftentimes the senior non-exec who's involved is not a digital native. We've had a case recently, very, a great non-exec director in many respects, but not somebody who could switch on a device himself, and getting somebody from that level, from that lack of technical understanding, to being able to manage a complicated data breach in 72 hours was a lot of sweat, and I think these gray hairs there are the result. So they want translation, they want explanation, they want education on current risks, not on past risks. They want amelioration, somebody to make it better, and particularly, as I've said, to look at remediation quickly, so that they have a good story to tell a regulator, good story to tell shareholders, good story to tell employees or affected individuals as to how they think this will never happen again. And then lastly, if they can't have all of those things, I think they want ease of termination. And I think we've seen from the Target breach onwards that unfortunately the CISO is often the person that the board focus on for the first step in their change management program after a breach. So I think it's important for every CISO to go out, reach out to the board in advance, explain to them their liability, how data breaches happen, how CISOs can't turn back the tide. You don't have a King Canute ability to stop data breaches happening. And also to encourage the board to do proper training as a board as well, so that they're battle ready, so that they can use muscle memory when attacks happen. Because without ending on a pessimistic note, I think for most organizations, a severe attack is just around the corner. And I know it's a cliche. The former director of the FBI said, didn't he? There are two sorts of organizations: those that have been hacked and those that don't know they've been hacked. Obviously, that's a cliche, but statistically, most organizations are going to see a severe breach this year. So I could have talked about loads of other things, and I can leave you with some links to some films and other resources. I know many of you know Jess Barker and Claudia Nathanson. We've some films with Jess and Claudia and some other people we know and like on our YouTube channel, which will expand on some of the pressures in working from home and the pressures on modern day CISOs. We've got a load of other resources there. If anyone wants a copy of the slides, then do email me, and I'll happily send them over. And I guess all that remains, I think we've promised questions, Richard, but we haven't promised answers. Is that right?
I don't like to hold to any promise. Can you back up to the slide before? I would urge everybody. Jonathan's got a great site, a lot of information. God knows I've gone there to plagiarize. I'm sorry, to do my research. No, but the videos and things, really informative stuff. I've looked on backgrounds for, like you said, Jonathan, everything from data adequacy, what's going to happen, what's not going to happen, to clarification on how to conduct a DPIA framework. So great resources. I'd strongly recommend everybody's checking out the site. Jonathan, in terms of, we've had a lot of the overwhelming questions are, can I trust my Tupperware? So I'm going to throw that aside and say, I hope people are kidding. But we did have 2 or 3 people asking for a little more illumination on cyber shorting, a better example, and maybe something that would indicate cyber shorting.
Yeah, so we're seeing, I mean, obviously, one of the trends of lockdown has been home stock trading, home share trading. And we have seen the US authorities in particular be worried about data breaches and the ability to make a quick buck on public exchanges with knowledge. So Martha Stewart would be an example in the US, where there was a data breach that individuals knew about who were inside the company, but the world at large didn't know about, and that enables people to trade shares or options to profit. So, as a simple example, I hack British Airways, and their share price is, for the sake of argument, £20. I know that hack attacks tend to move share price, let's say 5 to 8% of value. So I offer to sell BA shares at below market value. Let's say, you're going to have to keep up with my maths, £19.80, because I'm gambling on the fact that once I announce the fact that I have compromised BA systems, the shares drop to £19. Then I can buy shares at £19 to fulfill my contractual obligations, and I've made profit. So bear in mind that a lot of these gangs are really well connected with different financial networks. You know, it is alleged, for example, that some gangs use the Medellin cartel as a sort of back office function to move money around the world. And it's relatively easy these days to buy, to trade options, because you, the bad guys, know stuff that the market doesn't know. And as a result, when you drop the share price at a time of your choosing, you make big money. So I think it's a way that these gangs can almost repeat ransomware type attacks. But even if the company refuses to pay the ransom, they can get their money back another way by dropping the share price and profiting on that.
Certainly. Last question, Jonathan. We are cognizant of time, but I like this question. We got a couple of questions that referenced CISO accountability, and somebody asked very specific: if CISOs are vulnerable to being the fall guy, and you're seeing a high rate of turnover in CISOs in the industry. They're at a position for X number of months, and suddenly they move on, and so they seem to be recycled because of their what can they do, if anything, to manage that vulnerability to being fully accountable for things that are outside of their control without risking their profession?
Yeah, I think that is a tough. I think that's a tough one. I think things like training and being seen to train and being seen to lead by example is a key thing. I think a lot of those CISOs who've, if you like, escaped the other side of a data breach, it's because they've been seen to be proactive, to have advised the company on the risk. Some of them, to be honest, are still going to go anyway because the board feel that they've got to have a scapegoat. But I think you do get to sort of fight again somewhere else if you've been able to credentialize yourself and say that the incident happened despite your advice, not because of it. So I think for a lot of, it's almost like keeping a scrapbook. I'm not suggesting that people keep every single memo. And as I've said, it's tricky to take those memos if you create them, but almost like a scrapbook of achievement, and having that ability to demonstrate, as I say, that the breach happened despite what you said, not because of what you did.
I've actually, just to add to that, I've actually heard that some insurance providers are now offering professional indemnity insurance specifically for a CISO role, to make sure that any and all, in terms of accountability, that you take out on a personal basis to cover yourself professionally, just like consultants would take out professional indemnity insurance to cover a bad call.
I think you need a good broker for that.
Anyway,
I know we could talk about insurance forever.
Absolutely.
But we've seen
no. I'm just that was a different aspect in terms of you seeing
you're right.
the private market respond to a professional. Okay, we can thank you, Jonathan. That was as always, that was just stellar. Could you just forward it over? We've had a lot of people asking for your contact details. We've got them. Jonathan absolutely will take. We do have 2 or 3 questions that I'll make sure are followed up. But here's the contact details for both both Jonathan and myself, if you have anything, I know you've asked for, those of you who are interested in getting a copy of the slides, the whole presentation will be on YouTube, and of course they will be on both Jonathan's and the Risk Crew's website under webinars if you want to download or rewatch it. But Jonathan, I thank you. Stellar, absolutely outstanding stuff. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your insight with us, and thank you to everybody who attended today. Thanks for your questions. Thanks for the interaction. We'll get back to you if you have any outstanding. Can I ask you one more thing before you sign off? At the end of this, at the end of the presentation, we've got just a short survey of 4 or 5 questions. It takes all of 17 seconds, I think was the slowest somebody got through it, but just 3 or 4 questions about how you found the survey, what you'd like to see, other topics that so we can continue to bring you good content like this. Jonathan, my friend, thank you very much for joining us. I thank everybody for attending. And if you have any questions, please follow through with either Jonathan or I after the session. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you all. Take care.